On December 11, 1908, Amon Göth was born in Vienna. Göth was the SS officer in charge of directing the Plaszow concentration camp in Poland. After being executed for crimes against humanity, Göth, dubbed the Butcher of Plaszow, became infamously known through Ralph Fiennes's masterful portrayal in Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List. During the filming, Mila Pfefferberg, a Jewish survivor of the Plaszow camp, was introduced to Ralph Fiennes. The sight of him in an SS uniform made her tremble uncontrollably as he vividly reminded her of the sadistic SS officer. Göth was the only child of a wealthy Catholic family in Vienna involved in the publishing industry. At 17, Göth left his studies to join the Hitler Youth, and between 1927 and 1930, he was a member of the Steirischer Heimatschutzverband Wien, a radical and powerful faction of a nationalist and paramilitary anti-Semitic group called Heimwehr. In 1930, Göth joined the Austrian branch of the National Socialist Party, although he did not become a full member until May 31, 1931. Anyone who joined the party before Hitler's rise to power was considered an alter Kämpfer, or old fighter, a title loaded with prestige. Göth joined the Austrian SS in 1930 with the paramilitary rank of SS man with the number 43,673, but did not become a full member until 1932. Until January 1933, Göth served in the SS units Truppendaimel and Sturmlebardi until he was promoted to assistant of the 52nd SS Standard, a unit similar to a regiment, and was later promoted to Scharführer. After the Austrian National Socialist Party was outlawed, it moved to Munich, where Göth, taking advantage of his position, engaged in smuggling radios and weapons. Göth also consumed alcohol excessively and was involved in episodes of extreme violence. After being arrested by the police, he was released due to lack of evidence but was rearrested for the murder of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss. Göth managed to escape, and his flight took him to an SS training camp near the infamous Dachau concentration camp. In 1934, Göth married Olga Janoschek, whom he abandoned months later. After the annexation of Austria by Germany, Göth returned to Vienna, where he resumed his activities with the National Socialist Party. In a civil SS ceremony, he married Annie Geiger, with whom he had 3 children. Amon Göth and Operation Reinhard. Göth's efforts to relocate the Jewish population across Europe earned him a promotion to SS Untersturmführer. In 1942, Göth was transferred to Lublin, Poland, where under the orders of Brigadeführer Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police chief in the area, he participated in Operation Reinhard, the code name for the plan to murder all Polish Jews as a prelude to the Holocaust. Lublin, known as the Jerusalem of the Kingdom of Poland, was a city of great Jewish cultural significance. By 1939, it had 122,000 inhabitants, 42,830 of whom were Jews. The city boasted 12 synagogues, 2 Yiddish newspapers, 100 private prayer houses, a hospital, an orphanage, a hospice, and several Jewish schools. More than half of the small businesses and a third of the factories, especially in the fur, jewelry, and textile sectors, were Jewish-owned. When the Germans invaded Poland from the west, about 6,000 Jews moved to Lublin, close to the Russian border, seeking refuge. Predictably, on September 18, 1939, German troops occupied the city after weak Polish resistance. In reality, the resistance ended 10 days earlier when the Germans began persistent bombing of the civilian population. To maintain order with an iron hand, Hitler appointed Odilo Globoknik as SS and police chief in Lublin. Globoknik, an Austrian and a fanatical National Socialist, was a violent man with eccentric tastes. In the early 1930s, he joined the SS and collaborated in the downfall of the Austrian government and the annexation of Austria to Nazi Germany. Rewarded by Hitler with a post in Vienna and protected by Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, he began to engage in acts of corruption, seizing Jewish family money and earning the enmity of Hermann Göring. His scandalous lifestyle could not be concealed by Himmler, who dismissed him. Globoknik reinvented himself in Poland, where he fought with the Waffen SS regiment Germania. Subsequently, the Führer gave him a second chance in Lublin. At the end of October 1939, a survey indicated that 37,054 Jews remained in Lublin. The 5,000 who were missing, mostly the younger ones, had fled to Russia. Hitler, advised by ideologue Alfred Rosenberg and Himmler, launched the Nisko Plan. Among other delusions, the Third Reich initially proposed sending all Jews to the African island of Madagascar. Later, they decided to replace that idea with settling them in Lublin and the nearby city of Nisko. Initially, it was supposed to function as a Judenreservat, a Jewish reservation similar to those for Native Americans in the United States. But that was not the case. Tens of thousands were sent there for that purpose. The following year, the idea was also abandoned. The change was brutal, much worse than just a mere accumulation of prisoners. The governor of the Lublin Voivodeship, Zorna, declared the institution of the Lublin Ghetto for the Jewish population in March 1941. It was located in the poorest area. Soon after, officers and soldiers of the Führer's army took the Jews as their slaves. They were forced to clean the streets of the debris caused by the unequal attack. They were beaten and insulted without reason. Looting of their shops and houses became a daily occurrence. They were forced to pay 300,000 zlotys to the German army and to wear a badge identifying them as Jews. Those who had houses in the best parts of the city were expelled from them. The pride of Lublin, the Talmudic Academy's library, was burned to ashes. Still, the situation in the Lublin ghetto was not as desperate as in Warsaw. It may seem sarcastic, but it wasn't. In Warsaw, the situation was much more inhumane, if that's possible. It was notable how, little by little, a budding trade emerged between those inside and those outside. There was food, although diseases like typhus spread and overcrowding was significant. In mid-1941, Reichsführer Himmler ordered Globoknik to build concentration camps to house the Jews, while the Germans in the city took over properties and belongings. Operation Reinhardt, as the furious physical elimination of Jews in honor of Reinhard Heydrich was called, was set in motion. One of the camps was Belzec in the Lublin district. Another was established in a suburb of the city called Maidan, and its name will be remembered for the horror experienced there. Majdanek, which was under the direction of Karl Otto Koch. Construction began in October, so by early 1942 the Lublin ghetto was divided. On one side were the unemployed. On the other, those who worked for the Germans, about 25,000 people. Mass deportation to the Majdanek concentration camp began, along with mass killings. By Globoknik's order, the SS stamped the ghetto inhabitants to identify those who were workers. These were transferred to Ghetto B. On March 16, 1942, it was reported that Jews without this mark would be transferred to the Belzec concentration camp. Times accelerated. The Gestapo informed the Judenrat that 1,500 men and women had to present themselves daily to be sent to work in the East. They were lying, of course. Cynically, they allowed them to bring 15 kilograms of luggage and their jewelry and valuables. Under the custody of Police Battalion 101, they were first taken to the Great Synagogue and then to a square near the slaughterhouse. The first to be exterminated were the elderly and the sick. They were shot right there. The next morning, the transport to the Belzec extermination camp began. Some made a stopover in Majdanek, where there was a special shed where they were stripped of their clothes and belongings. Until then, the deportees were unaware of their true destination, but the horror was so incredible. The Germans had fallen so low on the human scale that when one escaped and told what was happening, no one took him seriously. On March 23rd, the so-called Lublin Jewish massacre ended. In 6 days, the Nazis had executed over 30,000 prisoners. Of course, they did not stop there. In Belzec, the methods of murder were horrific. In 6 chambers that each held 750 people, victims were gassed with carbon monoxide. That extermination camp only operated for 14 months, enough to murder over 600,000 Jews. The end of Belzec was not due to a sudden pang of conscience, but to the sheer massiveness of the crimes. Amon Göth and the Plaszow concentration camp. Amon Göth, the notorious SS officer in charge of the Plaszow concentration camp, played a pivotal role in establishing the camp's harrowing conditions. Göth's involvement began in the summer of 1940 when he supervised the construction of the Plaszow labor camp in Krakow, which later transformed into a concentration camp on January 11, 1944, following the directive of Oberfuhrer Julian Schindler, SS and police commander. Göth was assigned to the Totenkopfverbände unit of the SS, where his initial task was overseeing the construction of the Plaszow concentration camp. His transformation into the camp's commandant marked a significant shift in the camp's operations and the treatment of its prisoners. An ominous aspect of the camp's infrastructure was the use of Jewish tombstones as pavement for its roads, a stark reminder of the desecration caused in a place that previously housed two Jewish cemeteries. Before the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto, Plaszow housed approximately 2,000 prisoners. After the liquidation, the camp's population swelled to 12,000, peaking at 22,000 inmates in 1944, with the arrival of deported Jews from Hungary. During the inauguration speech of the newly built Plaszow camp, Commandant Amon Göth warned the prisoners of what awaited them with the words, "I am your God," a declaration of the absolute authority his rank granted him to act at his will. In 1943, during Göth's birthday celebration, he ordered Natalia Karp to play the piano for him. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, which impressed Göth so much that he spared her and her sisters' lives. Life within Plassow's confines for its prisoners was characterized by incessant fear. Executions and torture became daily occurrences, manifesting in shootings, hangings, and brutal dog attacks. Göth's draconian rule extended to arbitrary acts of cruelty, such as hanging two female prisoners for returning to the ghetto area without permission. On another occasion, he administered both lashes and gunshots as punishment to two prisoners caught smuggling extra food into the camp. Sally Huppert, who hid for a year, was eventually taken to the Krakow ghetto and later forced to stay in the Plaszow camp. When Germany invaded Poland, soldiers took her sisters and all the children to the Gestapo headquarters for work. Eventually, she arrived at the Krakow ghetto with a sister and some friends in 1942, where she worked in a factory. Those unable to find employment in the ghetto were sent to a concentration camp. Frequent executions occurred in the ghetto, and those without documents were executed. When the Krakow ghetto was liquidated, mothers had to leave their children to go to work, and SS raids resulted in the deaths of all the children. Sally was in the Plaszow camp before being transferred to a camp called Amelia. While at Plaszow, she hid from soldiers in the barracks as much as she could. Those who fell ill in the camp were sent to the hospital and executed. They ate soup and bread whenever they could get it. A typical day started at 8 a.m., sometimes with bread, and involved 12 hours of work before returning to their barracks. They never had news from the outside world. "We lived like animals," she expressed. The Krakow Plaszow concentration camp was organized by German SS soldiers, but was largely managed by Jewish police and prisoners, in addition to the SS soldiers. The Jewish police performed functions in the blocks, such as kapos, and maintained order. Their main responsibilities included overseeing both industrial and residential parts of the camp, maintaining order in the barracks, workshops, and assembly area, assigning prisoners to various work teams, inspecting and escorting prisoners involved in the construction and maintenance of the camp, keeping administrative records of arriving prisoners, and participating in forced labor. Victor Lewis, sharing his experience and testimony about the Plaszow camp, recounts that in the Krakow ghetto, people had to stand in long lines for hours just for a piece of bread whose value was incredibly inflated. A piece of bread that normally cost 50 cents could be worth $5. Victor explains that everyone in the ghetto thought it would be temporary. Never in our lives did we think it would last 5 years. The Germans would enter the ghetto and beat or kill anyone they disliked. If a German didn't like someone's beard, they would beat or kill them. While at Plaszow, Victor worked as an electrician and had permission to move around the camp with tools to repair any electrical wiring. Life consisted of consuming rations of bread and water. They worked, showered, ate and slept as instructed. Many days were spent watching Amon Göth shoot prisoners like a madman. No one knew who would be next. One of his most shocking experiences was witnessing the camp commandant shoot 2 SS men for failing to find 2 escaped prisoners. Those killed were thrown into a large pit on a nearby hill. Once the pit was full, the bodies were burned. Resistance within Plaszow was a daunting task, given the severe consequences imposed by Commandant Göth in response to escape attempts. Göth's brutal policy dictated that for each individual who managed to escape, 10 prisoners would be executed, illustrating the immense risks associated with disobedience. Despite these formidable challenges, acts of resistance persisted in various forms. Mutual assistance emerged as a predominant force, with organized support groups like the Zehnerschaft, exemplifying collective efforts to help fellow prisoners. Composed of women who orchestrated aid for their peers, the Zehnerschaft epitomized resilience and solidarity within the camp. In October 1943, a small underground group, the Jewish Fighting Organization, was formed by several Jewish kapos. Although they managed to gather some weapons, the murder of their leader, Adam Stab, led the resistors to adopt a more cautious approach, opting to await evacuation to the west rather than engage in an immediate uprising. Prisoners in Plaszow also benefited to some extent from external assistance. The Jüdische Unterstützungsstelle, a tolerated welfare organization, provided prisoners with food and medical care. Figures like Stanislaw Dobrowolski, head of the Krakow branch of the Council for Aid to Jews, and the renowned pharmacist Tadeusz Pankiewicz offered support to the prisoners. The Polish welfare organization Rada Glona Opiekuńcza sent additional food to Polish prisoners, some of whom shared it with Jewish prisoners. In early May 1944, Göth was informed that 10,000 Hungarian Jews would be sent to Plaszow. To make room for the newcomers, he ordered that all children in the camp be taken to the kindergarten, although they would be transferred to Auschwitz the next day for extermination. Göth executed prisoners indiscriminately every day. The commandant had 2 dogs, Rolf and Ralph, trained to attack and tear prisoners to death. Göth would shoot prisoners from his office window if he saw them standing or resting in the yard. One day he killed a cook because the soup was too hot and brutally treated his 2 maids, Helen Jonas Rosenzweig and Helen Hirsch, who feared for their lives daily. Göth's theory was that if one member of a work team escaped or committed an offense, the entire team should be punished. On several occasions, entire work crews were killed because one of their members had fled. Sometimes Göth personally carried out the murders. According to a witness, the chosen execution site was Hujowa Gorka Hill, where between 8,000 and 12,000 people were killed. When it opened, the camp housed 2,000 inmates, but at its peak, it held 25,000 prisoners, and about 150,000 people passed through it as a step before being transferred to other camps. During his time at Plaszow, Göth lived in a villa with horses and cars he rode within the camp and even had his own shoemaker, a prisoner who made him new shoes every week. At the height of the executions in Plaszow, Oskar Schindler engaged in a particular intelligence war with Göth. When Schindler requested that the Jews working in his factory be transferred to a sub-camp closer to the plant to save travel time to work, Göth agreed. From then on, Schindler discovered he could smuggle food and medicine with less danger to those barracks. The guards were bribed, and Göth never uncovered his movements. Schindler, a German businessman, had shown a unique interest in employing Jewish workers for his factories. His arrival at the Plaszow camp, under the guise of establishing a factory to produce kitchen utensils and munitions for the war, marked a turning point in his life and the history of many Jewish prisoners. At the moment when his personal ambitions seemed fulfilled, and he could retire from the war as a rich man, while his Jews would die in Plaszow and Auschwitz, Schindler spent all his money on bribes to Göth and other SS officers to protect and save the Jews. In a great paradoxical and symbolic change from his early life goals, he spent everything to save, protect, and feed his Jewish friends. He was arrested twice by the Gestapo on suspicion. He escaped thanks to his political and economic connections. At his factory near Plaszow, he instructed the guards not to enter without his permission. He spent every night in his small office to be able to intervene in case the Gestapo arrived. He also fed his workers as best as he could. The daily diet Schindler provided was 2,000 calories, whereas in other camps it barely reached 900. When food supplies were scarce, Schindler spent large sums of money buying food on the black market. In his factory, the elderly were registered as if they were 20 years old. Children were registered as adults. Lawyers, doctors, and artists were registered as metal workers and mechanics, so that everyone survived as essential elements for the military industry. In his factory, no one was beaten, no one was killed, no one was sent to death camps like nearby Auschwitz. When German forces retreated on the Eastern Front, Plaszow and its satellite camps were closed and dissolved. Schindler had no illusions about what that meant. Desperately, he deployed all his influence over his civil, industrial, and military contacts in Krakow and Warsaw. He finally went to Berlin to save his Jews from certain death. At great risk to his life, he used all his powers of persuasion, bribed without inhibition, fought and begged. In the heart of Berlin, where no one would have believed it possible, Schindler triumphed. He was granted permission to move his entire factory from Plaszow to Brunlitz in occupied Czechoslovakia. But more than that, something unheard of and surprising, he managed to take all his workers with him. Thus, the 1,098 human beings whose names were inscribed on Schindler's list avoided the fate of another 25,000 men, women, and children from Plaszow, who were sent to be exterminated in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, just 60 kilometers from Plaszow. Due to an error, 300 of Schindler's women were sent on a train to Auschwitz. Certain death awaited them. A Schindler survivor, Anna Ducklauer-Perl, later recalled, "I knew something had gone very wrong. They cut our hair and sent us to the showers. Our only hope was that Schindler would find us." After several weeks, Anna and the other Schindler women were taken to the showers again. They didn't know if this time it would be water or gas. Suddenly they heard a voice. "What are you doing with these people? They are my people." Schindler. He had arrived to rescue them, bribing the Nazis to retrieve the women from his list and reunite them with their families. The women were released, the only train that left Auschwitz with live Jews during the entire Second World War. When the women arrived in Brunlitz, weak, hungry, and cold, Schindler received them in the yard. They never forgot the image of Schindler at the door, and they never forgot his voice when, surrounded by German guards, he made an unforgettable promise. "Finally, you are with me. You are safe now. Do not fear anything. You have nothing to worry about." Until the liberation in the spring of 1945, Schindler used every means at his disposal to ensure the safety of his Jews. He spent every penny, and even his wife Emily sold her jewelry. He spent every mark on food, clothing, and medicine. He created a secret hospital inside his factory with medical equipment bought on the black market. There, Emily cared for the sick. Recent data reveals that Schindler spent nearly 4 million German marks to prevent his Jews from dying in concentration camps, an enormous sum of money for those times. Although Oskar Schindler had a mansion near the factory, he understood the Jews' fear of nightly SS visits. Just as in Plaszow, Schindler did not spend a single night outside his small office in the factory. On September 13, 1944, Göth was relieved of his command and charged by the SS with the theft of Jewish property, which, according to German law, belonged to the state. He was also accused of not adequately feeding the prisoners under his charge, violating camp rules on the treatment and punishment of inmates, and allowing unauthorized personnel access to camp records. However, the imminent German defeat in World War II caused the charges to be dropped in early 1945. Shortly thereafter, Göth was diagnosed with a mental illness and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Bad Tölz. In May 1945, Amon Göth was arrested by the American Army under General Patton. Dressed in a Wehrmacht uniform when arrested, he did not admit to being an SS officer. But when transferred to a prisoner camp located on the grounds of the former Dachau concentration camp, Göth was identified by former inmates of the Krakow-Plaszow concentration camp. The trial of the former camp commander was held between August 27 and September 5, 1946, and was overseen by the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland, which had been recognized by the Allied forces. Göth remained impassive in the face of the charges against him. He claimed he was following orders and instructions from his superiors. He also asserted that the punishments inflicted during his tenure at the camp, including the death penalty, fell within his disciplinary jurisdiction as camp commander and were in accordance with the prevailing German regulations. After being found guilty of homicide for killing, mutilating, and torturing a large, unspecified number of people, the first conviction of its kind in a war crimes trial, Amon Göth was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on September 13, 1946, at the Montelupich prison in Krakow, not far from the site of the Plaszow camp. His last words were, "Heil Hitler." After 2 failed attempts to hang him, the butcher of Plaszow was finally executed. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered into the Vistula River.